We are continuing, as you know, our studies of the history of the church, Thy Kingdom Come, the history and destiny of the people of God. If you've been in this class, as I know many of you have, then you know we are just reaching the end of the first segment. If we arbitrarily divide church history up into 500-year slices, then the first 500 years we call ancient Christianity, which goes from roughly 0 AD to 500. 500 is kind of an arbitrarily chosen number, but given that the collapse of Rome was roughly about that time, and really the rise of the first great medieval pope was about that time, that's the first benchmark we've chosen. Then that first 500 years can be subdivided. And so we've looked at the first century apostolic Christianity. We've looked at what's called ante-Nicene Christianity, that is the history of the church up until Nicaea, which is important not simply because of Nicaea, but because that's when Christianity became a legitimate religion. Constantine, of course, shifted the disposition of Rome, endorsed Christianity, took a sort of official policy of tolerance toward other religions, but nevertheless, clearly, Christianity kind of moves to the first of the class at this point and is clearly the one that's being advocated by Constantine and his successors, with the exception of Julian the Apostate, who reigned for about 2 years, tried to push Rome back to paganism, failed, and otherwise the rest of the Roman emperors up until the collapse of Rome were officially Christian. We don't know the state of their heart, obviously, but nevertheless, as far as their official policy was concerned, that was their status. And it's that period of time that we're looking at right now, which would be after Nicaea up until the end of this period, up until the collapse of Rome, roughly 175 years. It would be from 325 to 475, roughly, to 500, so it's that period of time that we have in mind. We're going to spend roughly 2 weeks here. This morning, I'd like to focus on the preeminently most important person who lived during that period of time, at least from a human vantage point, from the point of view of the church's history, and that's the life of the great Augustine. And so this morning, it's the story of Augustine. Then next week, I'd like to take a step back and put his life in a bit of a socio-ecclesiastical, political context, and then we'll move on from there into the Middle Ages, and we'll be moving rather rapidly through the next 500 years or so, getting up to the time of Thomas Aquinas. So anyway, Augustine is our person of the morning. Some people confuse Augustine with a city in Florida, which is called St. Augustine. They are not to be confused. Now, St. Augustine is a city in Florida. Augustine is a great thinker and champion in the history of the church. Aurelius Augustine. So, not that I want to be too dogmatic about this point, but his name is pronounced Augustine. So if I can move on from there, that's going to be the first point I'd like to affirm. Many people say of Augustine that he's the greatest theologian of the first 1,000 years of the church's history. That is very safe to say. Others would argue, and I tend to side with them, that he's the greatest theologian of all church history, leaving out, of course, the New Testament itself. But in terms of great thinkers of the church, it's Augustine who is the one who becomes the shoulders upon which so many others stand. A great genius. It was providentially important that he lived and did his work when he did. Had he lived earlier, when Christianity was a persecuted religion, it would certainly have likely impaired his ability to have the great influence that he did. Had he been born later, at a time of the feudal kind of social system and so on, the likelihood that he would have had the influence that he did would have been impaired. But he lives at this particular, rather unique time when Christianity is officially endorsed by Rome. Rome is in her waning years, and yet Christianity has the, as it were, opportunity to speak to the world. And in that context, Augustine himself becomes in many ways the great voice of orthodoxy, and he puts in place principles of understanding that served the church certainly through the medieval period. It became one of the great thinkers behind the Protestant Reformation, we would say. Rome would probably differ with that slightly, but nevertheless, certainly the great reformers owed a lot to Augustine and looked to him as their great thinker, their great patron, as it were, if I can use that term. Augustine, of course, is not simply important because of his contribution in Christian thought, but if you survey all kinds of different academic disciplines, you'll find his name popping up. And so if you were to study, for example, Western civilization, you'd certainly run into Augustine. If you were looking at Greek and Roman civilization, church history, as we are doing here, certainly an undergraduate major in philosophy is going to lead a person probably on several occasions to various of Augustine's philosophical contributions. He's been important in Christian apologetics and great literature of the world. All of these would be various academic areas where the name of Augustine and the writings of Augustine would show up. He's also interestingly been called the father of psychology. Many people think Freud is the father of psychology, and maybe in some ways he is, but Augustine is really one of the first people in world history who adopts what you'd call a highly introspective approach to life, looking deep inside the recesses of the human soul and learning from that not only lessons about God's grace and theology, but lessons about human personality, and writes about these things so acutely that to call him in some ways the father of psychology is probably not an inappropriate contribution. He wrote about 93 major works, wrote a small library, and many of those, of course, have been highly influential in church history. The two that are most famous, one is called The City of God, which was Augustine's great architecture, you might say, his architectural design for the church. Roman Catholic thought has owed a great deal to the City of God, but all Christian people can gain immensely by reading it and reflecting on its great understanding of the way in which the church plays out in history. The other work that is, of course, probably the most famous is called the Confessions of Augustine. Kind of an intensely introspective spiritual autobiography that he writes late in his life, reflecting on his entire life. We're very happy to have the Confessions because it makes a lecture such as the one I'm giving you right now possible, because a great deal of what we know about Augustine really comes to us by his own writings in the Confessions, so I'm relying heavily on that source for much of the material I'll be giving you. Later thinkers, of course, tend to acknowledge Augustine freely. Calvin, who we as Presbyterians look back to as the great thinker behind the Reformed tradition, of which we are a part, owed a great deal to Augustine. If you look at his most famous and important product, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, you'll find that Calvin, who was a man of letters, quoted many ancient sources, both pagan and Christian. You'd find him citing Tacitus, Cicero, Seneca, Hilary, and Thucydides and other sources, Herodotus. He's very conversant with all of these, freely cites from them. But far and away, the most frequently cited source outside the Bible itself in Calvin's writings is Augustine. If you look at, for example, the index of citations, for example, you'll find 3 full pages of just citations, line item citations to Augustine. He owed him a great deal and freely acknowledged it and believed himself to be thoroughly within the Augustinian tradition. Luther himself, before his conversion, was, not surprisingly, a monk in the Augustinian tradition. It was an Augustinian order. And, of course, he was quick to acknowledge that his own understanding of grace and faith and the principal ideas that became the underpinnings of the Protestant theology, as articulated by both Luther and Calvin, came from Augustine. That Augustine was the mind, as it were, that informed the mind of Luther, and he applied in many ways those principles at the time of the Reformation. But the Catholic Church also, of course, embraces, in fact, claims Augustine. Everybody wants him. We Protestants want him. The Catholics want him. We're all fighting over him. And probably he rises above all of us, you see, in terms of the depth of his insight. But the Catholic Church is, of course, made great use of Augustine, particularly his understanding of the church. That became very important in later years, and to this day has been quite influential. So anyway, Augustine is remembered for all those reasons. One might think that given the great contribution that he made, Augustine must have just been a kind of ivory tower academic, somebody that sat around thinking great thoughts and writing great books and never, saw the light of day. But that would be far from the truth, because he was also an active churchman. He was the Bishop of Hippo at a time when the church was torn apart by various controversies. He was a pastor. He preached on a weekly basis. He counseled. He participated in the life of the church. If he were a Presbyterian, you would see him at Presbytery meetings. He would stand up and raise points of order and otherwise participate. So, we must not labor under the delusion that he was simply a scholar tucked away in some safe place, not really participating actively. The two great controversies that threatened the church during the time of Augustine were the Donatist controversy, D-O-N-A-T-I-S-T, Donatist, which was a big dispute over the sacraments of the church and the legitimacy of sacraments when they were basically administered by clergy whose character might be of concern, and that was a whole issue. His position on that, which he successfully advocated, became standard orthodoxy, both for the Roman Catholic Church and for the Protestant churches to this day. The other great controversy is called the Pelagian controversy, having to do with a monk whose name was Pelagius, who really imported a kind of humanistic view of the human character and the collateral views related to God's grace and salvation and so on. And Augustine had a huge debate with him, and that became very important as well. So my point is that Augustine was an active player, a very important figure, not only for the contribution he made purely intellectually, but because of his actual participation in the church. All of this has been a bit of a prolegomena here, but what I'd like to do now is open with prayer, and then we'll actually do a survey of Augustine's life. So let's just pray, and then we'll get started. Father, we are grateful that you, out of your abundant mercy, have given great gifts to your church. And among those great gifts are great people, men and women, who you have specially ordained and set apart for strategic and important purposes. And as we think of this one who we all owe so much to humanly, the great Augustine, who you used in such mighty ways and continue to in the thinking and the understanding of the church, we ask that you would bless our consideration of his life, and that the lesson that we would learn through him, at least in part, would be that he was simply an instrument of your grace, and that all of us can be that kind of person in some great or small way to be used by your grace for good. And so we ask that our reflection on his life would lead us to that understanding. In the name of Christ, amen. Augustine was born Aurelius Augustine in November 13th, 354 A.D. If you're good at your arithmetic, you know that's about 30 years after the Council of Nicaea, 30 years roughly after, in fact more like 40 years after Christianity has ceased to be an illegal religion. So things by now have at least settled down in that sense. He's born about 17 years after the death of Constantine. And so his life is at a time, as I say, when that period in which the church was a persecuted religion is over. If anything, we're on the other side of the fence, and the church has become a persecuting religion of certain forms of paganism, which in fact becomes part of the story of Augustine himself. He was born into a mixed family religiously. His father was a pagan. His mother, Monica, was a Christian. And of course, she has become the model of Christian mothers. Monica is one of the most famous women in the history of the church and is a great standard, I would say, for womanhood as we reflect on what that means. This praying mother, Monica, who was, she knew what tough love was with her wayward son, but nevertheless, she never ceased to pray for him. Aurelius Augustine was given the finest education that would be available for a young person in that day. His mother and father, at great expense and personal sacrifice, invested in his mind and in his education. And if I can just do a little footnote here, addressing myself to we who are parents and grandparents in the room, there is no better investment that you can make than in the mind of our children and grandchildren. It's no accident that as you survey church history, you find repeatedly that God uses those who have been given good educations to accomplish great things. I'm not saying that God is strapped, to good educations, but it just is pretty obvious that the people who God has used in mighty ways to change the course of history for good have been those who had parents that invested heavily in their intellect, in their academic training. And certainly Augustine and many others would fall within that category. So, Monica and her husband gave up a few vacations, didn't drive such a nice car, and so that they could invest in this young mind. Augustine, for his part, was a prodigious little scholar. He, in fact, later jokes in the Confessions about the evil of I will call it the evil genius that he was before his conversion, that he was plotting evil things, he says, from his mother's breast. That, from a very early age, he had a cognition there that was impressive, and so this was part of his story. But nevertheless, he was one possessed of a lust for knowledge. He just acquired it easily and loved it, and that was really one of the most characteristic features of him. He did attend church with his mother, didn't like it very much. It wasn't that he was bored so much, but he just was disgusted with this lowly religion, Christianity. He thought the Bible was boorish, and he couldn't believe that intelligent people were actually concerned with these fables and silly stories and kind of low, when you could read Plato, when you could absorb Aristotle, why would you bother, you see, with something like the Bible? So that was really his attitude in those early years, but nevertheless, in deference to his mother, he would attend church with her. The irony, of course, is, of all of that it was Augustine, after his conversion, who more or less devoted his life with a single-minded passion to the study of that book that he had earlier found boorish. And at the end of his life was saying he'd only begun to plumb the depths of the truth that was there, But before his eyes had been opened to see it, that was really his attitude. When he turned 19 years old, even though he was skeptical of Christianity, he was very interested in religion generally, and he embraced what was called the Manichaean religion. It was kind of a pagan, quasi-Christian, sort of syncretistic, eclectic religion at the time that borrowed the best, sort of cafeteria religion, the kind of thing you'll find these days in some quarters. Manichaeism had a kind of a rationalistic spirit to it. It would be very like 19th century liberalism, you might say, that was very naturalistic, humanistic, kind of skeptical of the big things, but called people to live a good life, viewed Jesus as a great teacher, great model, great example, someone whose life we should certainly emulate, but we must not get carried away with this notion that he's God incarnate, for goodness sakes, or a miracle worker, or any of those kinds of things, because that obviously could not happen. So the Manichaeans were sort of the upbeat, sophisticated, up-to-date type intellectuals of the day, and that was very appealing to Augustine, and he embraced that movement at that time. And the effect that it had on him was to lead him all the more to studies of matters of classical ethics and morality and so on. And while he didn't personally embrace much of that, nevertheless he was interested in it from an academic point of view. And he was also interested in Christ, insofar as Christ in the Manichaean religion was viewed with some degree of respect. Not worshipped, but at least was included among some of the great religious leaders and teachers of history. His mother, Monica, was not pleased when Augustine informed her that he was going to embrace Manichaeism. That was just about the straw that broke her back, She had been very patient. She'd prayed for him diligently. She'd been, giving him Bible verses and all of the things that mothers are supposed to do to try to get their young wayward children to go in the right direction. But when he finally told her that that was exactly what he was going to do, was become a Manichae, she said, "I've had it with you." And she booted him out. This, as I say, this was tough love. She said, "I'm going to pray for you, but you're not welcome in this home anymore." And this was partly because she was so incensed and outraged that he would actually consciously abandon the Christian, training that he had had and embrace Manichaeism. Is partly because Manichaeism at that point was an illegal religion, as Christianity once had been. So now, you see, paganism had become illegal, and this really meant that Augustine himself was involved in something of a civil crime to be involved in Manichaeism. So partly she was concerned about that as well. Well, having done that is, Monica having taken that posture toward her son, he became super scornful of the Christian faith. Up until that time, he'd at least been modestly accommodating, kind of deferential, for the sake of his mother. But now that she was taking the strong position with him, that was it. And so he not only basically rejected and openly ridiculed the church, but he began to set himself to the task of turning as many people as he could influence away from the Christian faith. So he became an affirmative enemy of Christianity when he was about 19 to 20 years old. And given his towering intellect and mastery of matters academic, he was no small enemy, you see, for the church to be dealing with at that point, even at that fairly young age. He became, at age 20, a professor or a teacher of rhetoric in at the college level. Now, this was not a prestigious college yet, but nevertheless, it gave him this opportunity to be one of these college professors. Sometimes we worry when we send our kids off to college that they're going to have some college professor whose single ambition in life is to get up in whatever class it might be, anything from mathematics to philosophy, and ridicule Christianity, and we want our kids to be strong and founded and be able to weather that kind of assault. Well, that was what Augustine was. He took no greater delight than to take young, impressionable Christian types that showed up in his classes in rhetoric, which was the art of persuasion, closely affiliated to philosophy, and just blow holes through the Christian faith. And he was pretty good at it because he'd grown up in at least by his mother's instruction, in a Christian home. And he knew the Bible pretty well, and he knew all the arguments against Christianity. He was pretty effective, you see. So during those years of time, he later tells us how he laments those that he probably pushed away from the faith in that early time of his life. But nevertheless, he did that. His skills as a professor of rhetoric increased through that time. He also continued to study Manichaean religion, and that really accounts for that roughly 10 years, from about the age 20 to the age of 30. That's essentially the life he lived. An interesting kind of ironic thing happened during this time. Rhetoric, as I say, was the art of persuasion. We don't have a branch of learning these days that we commonly call rhetoric, but the most close affiliation to it these days would be a kind of a mix of debate and philosophy and public speaking, that idea. And so all of those taken together was the sort of discipline that Augustine was teaching. And that led him to study some of the great so-called skeptics of history. Greek philosophy had among its many schools of philosophical thought what were called the Greek skeptics. And the skeptics essentially were delighted to find whatever flaws they could in whatever argument you might want to advance. The whole principle of what was called equipollens, which is that for every argument for some proposition, you can bring an equally cogent argument against it, you see. So I assert to you the proposition philosophically, God is. And for every argument that I bring in support of that, this skeptical attitude would be you could bring an equally forceful argument against it. So they sort of mount up on both sides of the ledger, and in the final analysis we are left in a state of skepticism. Who knows? We cannot know. Well, this can be very useful for a teacher of rhetoric because it gives you an arsenal of equipment to use against your advocate, you see, to find the underpinnings of the argument that are loose and pull them away so your enemy's argument collapses. But as he was doing this study, he was continually finding himself entertaining skeptical questions that he felt should be asked of the Manichaean religion. And he couldn't find anybody to answer those questions. Until finally, at some inconvenience, he arranged to have a meeting with a fellow by the name of Faustus, who was reputed to be the great Manichae guru of the day. One of those people who was hard to get at, but who had the profound insights and answers that a person would want in order to really be satisfied with these great questions. And so Augustine, at about the age 28, 29, he tells us, sat down with this fellow whose name was Faustus. And he was so excited because he thought, finally, some of these deep questions that have been riddling him, he could find answers. He was particularly perplexed at issues related to evil and its origins. And these were matters that he addressed deeply later, you see, in his own theology. But now, as a young man, he was just trying to figure it out, and he assumed that Faustus would be able to give him the answers. So he sat down and began asking his questions, and he describes later how utterly disillusioned he was, because it became quite obvious early on in the conversation that Augustine was transcendently more competent than Faustus. This was kind of like, I'm imagining it would be something like Albert Einstein having some questions about mathematics and sitting down with a high school mathematics teacher. Nothing against high school mathematics teachers, you understand that. But, if Albert Einstein is sitting down asking you questions about points that are perplexing him in mathematics, what are you going to do with a thing like that? You say, I'm not going to even venture to go and try to answer his questions. If those are his questions, I'm not even smart enough to know what the question is, let alone venture an answer. And that was kind of the disparity between the competence of an Augustine on the one hand and this Faustus, who's otherwise not heard of in history, on the other, you see. And so this was quite a disillusioning and more or less catastrophic moment for him, because he had really pinned his hopes in many ways on the Manichaean religion. And now to find out that the great master was unable to address these questions really left him in a state of a kind of vacuum spiritually. And this was very distressing. He just talks later about how troubled he was by that. Nevertheless, in his professional career, he got at this point the big break. Everybody in life wants a big break. Everybody wants to be discovered. And this really was about the time that Augustine was, as it were, discovered. He had been teaching in a kind of, middle-of-the-road college, doing okay, but a professorship opened up at the university located in Milan, Italy, which was one of the major institutions of the day. It'd be comparable to a Stanford or a Harvard or Princeton or something, one of the great prestigious institutions, and this position was offered to him, not to be, as it were, the chair of the department, but to be in a very elevated and prestigious role in that department of rhetoric. And so Augustine, even though he was deflated because of this little incident with the Manichaean individual, nevertheless saw this as kind of the great moment when he was finally going to achieve the professional satisfaction that he had been longing for so many years. So he took that position, which happened to be, as I say, in Milan, Italy. But one of the things that he discovered, that I'm sure many have discovered, and probably some of us in this room have discovered, is that no amount of professional success will finally satisfy the aching hunger of the human soul. That money doesn't fix it. That professional prestige doesn't fix it. And Augustine had disillusionment piled on top of disillusionment now, because not only had his religion failed him, but he found that even in this position which he had aspired to and indeed lusted for, he was still dissatisfied, empty, and the malaise of life seemed to be setting in. And he thought to himself, well, maybe love is the answer. Now, I haven't given you much about this piece of the story, but Augustine was not exactly a model of Christian morality up until this time. In fact, in the Confessions, he makes it clear that by the time he was about 16 years old, he had been involved in virtually unrestrained sexual escapades. He was given to the use of drink, and I don't know if they had drugs back then, but if they did, I'm sure he used them. He tended to carouse and hang out with the wrong crowd in the wrong places, and So this was really the story of his life. This is part of what brought such grief to Monica during those years. He took a concubine by the time he was 17, but that didn't restrain him from still being involved in a lot of, less than really impressive kinds of moral conduct. And that had really continued all through these years. And he viewed himself later as really being something of slave, I'd say, to these passions that were inflamed within him, unable, in spite of the Manichaean exhortation that he should live a more virtuous life, he was just unable to rid himself of them. But at this point in time, 30 years old, he thought, well, maybe what I need in my life is true love. And so he found a young woman that he thought he truly loved and entered into an engagement with her. This was when he was 30 in Milan. Engagements in those days tended to last a long time. This was to be a 2-year engagement. Well, the concubine that he'd had with him all during these years said, I've had it with you, So she was out the door. When he got engaged, she left. And now Augustine was looking at 2 years of nobody, you see, because he wasn't married yet. And so he took another concubine at that period of time to kind of cover him, during the period that was stretching out there before him. I'm trying to keep this tasteful, you understand, but you see what's going on. And so anyway, this was really the circumstance of his life when he's there at about 30 years of age. And then one other thing that just compounds the agony is he had a very severe health problem at that point. We're not clear what it was. Physicians who have read that section of the Augustine and tried, at this distance to diagnose it based on his own self-description have thought it sounded mostly like tuberculosis. Or something similar, but it seems to be a disease of the lungs or the chest, and it really threatened his career. It threatened his very life for some time. And so this was not a happy moment. This was a time of some deep distress. And yet, as you might imagine, this time of deep distress was actually orchestrated in the providence of God to be the kind of events, the kind of circumstances that would actually bring him ultimately to his faith in Christ. As Augustine surveys this moment, these 2 years or so, he identifies 3 different factors, all of which more or less were contributing together to bring him to the moment of his conversion. The first of those factors was the preaching of Ambrose, A-M-B-R-O-S-E, called typically in church history, St. Ambrose. Ambrose was a powerful preacher in Milan. He had a huge church. He had a worldwide influence at that time. He was considered one of the greatest thinkers and preachers of the age. He was a great academic master. He brought ideas from both East and West, and yet somehow brought them together, synthesized them in such a way that his advocacy of the Christian faith was not only powerful in terms of the preaching of the Word, but was very respectable in terms of just the academic acumen and mastery that he displayed in every sermon that he gave. And Augustine began attending services at his church, not because he was the least bit interested in Christianity, which he thought, as I've already said, was sort of boorish and stupid, but he thought, this guy is good. And here's Augustine, he's a professor of rhetoric, and he figures maybe he can pick up some techniques, some methodology. Anybody that can make the Christian faith sound as good as this guy can make has to be pretty good, And so he began showing up and attending services there at that church. Well, you can probably guess what began to happen, that Augustine, notwithstanding his disposition of hostility toward the Christian faith, was nevertheless penetrated by these powerful messages, these sermons that would, as he was sitting there trying to think about how the techniques and the methods of rhetoric and persuasion were working, all the while the content, was just boring, like Woody was saying this morning in his sermon, boring into his heart, deeper and deeper and deeper. And of course, the point in his heart that it was reaching with the greatest force was Augustine's conscience. And he was feeling more and more miserable every time he heard a sermon. He felt more sinful. He felt more corrupted, and he thought back over the life he'd lived, and as he heard these great standards of righteousness and holiness that came from the lips of Ambrose, that he saw how miserably short of that mark he fell, and it just continued to mount up with no small degree of weight on his conscience. And so that was one of the influences. I might say just in passing that Augustine, all through his life, viewed Ambrose as his great mentor. He always viewed himself as inferior to Ambrose to the end of his life, which is ironic, of course, because from the judgment of church history, Augustine is transcendently superior. I mean, Ambrose was wonderful. Ambrose was, a great preacher and thinker, but Augustine was just in a whole different class. But Augustine's own humility and modesty, he never saw it. And he always felt Ambrose was the great mentor behind him. And certainly that was the first great influence that began to get to his conscience. Interestingly, another influence he identifies, which might be surprising, was the influence of what's called Neoplatonism, another kind of cult, a quasi-philosophical religious movement of the day coming from Plotinus and others. And certainly not Christian, although again it did kind of tipped its hat to Christianity and so on, but a very heavy accent on the life of the spirit. The nearest thing I can correlate that to in contemporary culture would be the New Age religion. If you took out of New Age some of the more pagan expressions of it and the crystals and pyramids and that kind of stuff, what you have in terms of the basal kind of philosophy wouldn't be too dissimilar from Neoplatonism, at least in some respects. And one thing you have to say is that it does cause, the New Age, I'm not here to advocate New Age religion, but I'm just trying to say this about it at least, that one of the things it can cause people to do in our highly hectic and frenzied kind of culture is slow down and think about the life of the spirit a little bit, and, that may be good. In any case, in the life of Augustine, that little influence in itself tended to get him thinking about the inward life and not be quite so obsessed with his professional achievement and think about some of these more important inner matters. So he actually identifies Neoplatonism as one of the influences that eventually brought him to the feet of the cross. But the incident, of course, that's most famous is the so-called garden incident, in which Augustine, with a friend of his, Alypius, was in some garden area, presumably like a little private park of some friend or acquaintance. We're not quite sure where it was, but nevertheless, he was there, and he was just wrenching with the emotions, because he had really come to the point finally when he wanted to come to Christ. He wanted to convert, and he couldn't, because he couldn't free himself from the shackles of his own addiction to sinful behaviors and vices. And how could he do it? How could he make the step and leave behind the old and move to the new? And he felt helpless and imprisoned. And he's there really in a highly emotional state with his friend, lamenting this circumstance. And this is called the garden episode. I really can't improve on his own description of it. And so with your permission, I'd like to just read briefly the couple of paragraphs from the Confessions in which he describes this incident. And it goes like this. He says, "But when a deep consideration had from the secret bottom of my soul drawn together and heaped up all my misery in the sight of my heart, there arose a mighty storm, bringing a mighty shower of tears, which that I might pour forth wholly in its natural expression, I rose from Alypius. Solitude was suggested to me as fitter for the business of weeping. So I retired so far that even his presence would not be a burden to me." So he's just overwhelmed with emotion. He wants to be free even from the presence of Alypius, be by himself, so that he can pour forth, as it were, his weeping and his emotions in this agonizing moment. Thus was it then with me, and he perceived something of it, for something I suppose I had spoken, wherein the tones of my voice appeared choked with weeping, and so had risen up. And then remained where we were sitting, most extremely astonished. I cast myself down, I know not how, under a certain fig tree, giving full vent to my tears, and the floods of mine eyes gushed out, an acceptable sacrifice to thee. The whole Confessions, by the way, is written kind of like a prayer. So you get that sort of expression. "And not indeed in these words, but yet to this purpose, spake I much unto thee," quote, "and you, Lord, how long? How long, Lord? Will you be angry with me forever? Remember not my former iniquities, for I felt that I was held by them. I sent up these sorrowful words, how long, tomorrow and tomorrow, why not now? Why not is there this hour an end to my uncleanness. So you hear the agony of someone under the heavy pressure of God's Spirit, in a sense asking, how long until I can finally come? You see, he feels his own inability to come, and yet he wants to. And then this interesting little continuation. So, as I was speaking and weeping in the most bitter contrition of my heart, when lo, I heard from a neighboring house a voice, as of a boy or girl, I know not, chanting and oft repeating, "Take up and read, take up and read." Famous words in church history. Take up and read. And so Augustine's there, he's praying, he's lamenting, he's crying, he's weeping, and all of a sudden a little voice comes over the fence. Some little kid playing hopscotch, or skip roping or something down the sidewalk, and the sing-song from the child. Take up and read, take up and read. Instantly my countenance altered. I began to think most intently whether children were wont in any kind of play to sing such words. Nor could I remember ever to have heard the like. He's trying to think, you hear these little children sing-song things, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, or whatever, that kind of stuff. The little children will do it. And he was trying to remember, he couldn't remember anything that had that set of words to it. He says, so checking the torrent of my tears, I arose, interpreting it to be no other than a command from God to open the book and read the first chapter I should find, which, by the way, is not an approved Bible study method. Which Augustine would probably agree with. But at this particular moment, that's what he felt he was compelled to do. Grab the Bible, randomly open it, anywhere it should fall open, and begin reading whatever was first presented to his eyes. And so, and then he goes on and tells a little story in that connection. For I had heard of Anthony, that coming in during the reading of the gospel, he received the admonition as if what was being read was spoken to him. Go, sell all you have, give to the poor, and you shall have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me. And by such oracle he was forthwith converted unto thee. Anthony was a very famous anchorite at the time. He lived out in the wilderness. He was sort of one of the beginning forces behind the monastic movement. Very famous. Augustine held him in very high regard. So he remembered something similar had happened in Anthony's life. Eagerly then I returned to the place where Alypius was sitting, for there I had laid the volume of the Apostle when I arose thence. I seized, opened, and in silence read that section on which my eyes first fell. Quote, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying, but put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh in concupiscence. Every one of those vices, of course, was the story of Augustine's life. And so it cut him to the core. He goes on and says, no further would I read, nor needed I. For instantly, at the end of this sentence, by a light, as it were, of serenity infused into my heart, all the darkness of doubt vanished away. And somehow, in hearing those words from the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 13, I believe it is, he is changed, transformed in that instance. And that, I think, Augustine would certainly attribute to be the moment of his new birth, his regeneration. So this was a radical moment in his life, a time of remarkable conversion. This took place in 386 AD. As it turns out, his mother happened to be in Milan at that time visiting. And so she was one of the first to hear, and Augustine goes ahead and details the great joy that swept through her soul, of course, that now her son had finally come to faith. In fact, when Monica was in Milan, she had made a special appointment to meet with Ambrose, and had gone to Ambrose in a private conversation and had, weeping in his presence, told the story of her young son who was attending services there. And Ambrose was so impressed with the brokenness of her heart and her weeping that he made that very famous statement, which is probably not great theology, but was a wonderful assessment of the moment, when he said, how could the child of so many tears be lost? Because Monica had shed so many tears over her son all through the years. In any event, 386 is the year of his conversion. Adolf Harnack describes the significance of that in these words, quote, thus there was given to the church incomparably the greatest man who between St. Paul the Apostle and Luther the Reformer, the Christian church has possessed. And that is certainly at least the case, if not more. Augustine became a passionate Christian on his conversion in 386. He was baptized on Easter Sunday, 387. He resigned his appointment to the University of Milan about that time. This prestigious professional career of his came to an abrupt conclusion. In 388, he moved to North Africa, to a very tiny little obscure town, and set up a kind of little private personal study center with a few close friends. All he wanted to do was digest and learn the Christian teaching. The Bible he had once despised became the only thing he had any desire to study and read. And so for some years, he lived a very simple life, almost an ascetic life during that time with these few friends. He gave up his desire, that is, his plans to be married. All of that went by the boards, and he gave himself in a kind of single-hearted passion to the study of the Scriptures. He never desired to, as it were, move up the chairs in the church. That was not his design. Nevertheless, in 391, more or less under compulsion, he was forced to become a presbyter of the church in Hippo, which was nearby, kind of a little second-rate sea town there in North Africa. He didn't want that. He wasn't looking for anything in the sort of the politics of the church, if you know what I mean. He was just trying to, he just wanted to learn Christ, learn the Scriptures, but he felt the need to be obedient to the leadership within the church, and so he submitted to that. 5 years later, because he distinguished himself so remarkably in his life of faith, he was made the bishop of Hippo. And that was the position he held for the rest of his life till his death in 430. He was a pastor, he was a preacher, he was a counselor, but transcendently, of course, he was a thinker, he was a theologian. As I indicated to you earlier, he took an active role in the life of the church and some of the great controversies that swept through the world of Christianity at that time. He was an active player in those. To try to go into detail into all that took place during that lengthy and remarkable career would obviously be way beyond the bounds of what we can do right now. I'll be alluding to it to some degree in the next 2 or 3 weeks. But I'd like to move swiftly to the conclusion of his life, which was in 430. This was a time when the barbarian invasion and threat to Rome was increasingly mounting, and in fact the little region where Augustine was living was particularly in the crosshairs of the Vandals, that barbarian tribe, and a great deal of destruction and misery was coming in their wake. And in fact, the very community where Augustine was laboring was put under siege in the year 430. Augustine himself viewed this as a remarkable sign of God's judgment against a pagan culture which had really not bowed the knee appropriately to King Jesus, and that even though it was coming at the hands of Vandals and barbarians, nevertheless by God's providence, as God had brought Nebuchadnezzar against Israel as a form of judgment, so God was bringing these against Rome as a form of judgment. And so he prayed for the empire, he prayed for the people, he prayed that through all of this there would be a mighty turning to Christ. But at the same time, being now about 76 years of age, he said this, quote, "Bear in mind that I ask God to deliver this town or strengthen his servants, but in any case, take me away." Augustine had now, sort of fought the good fight and was coming to the end of his earthly tenure and was ready to be taken home. He fell at that time into his last illness when the city was actually under siege. He always taught and believed that people should die in a state of high penitence. And so while he was there on his deathbed, he instructed that the 7 penitential psalms that we find in the book of Psalms should be suspended on the walls of his bedroom, kind of like butcher paper, big lettering so that he could easily read them from his bed. And then over and over, day after day, for the last few days of his life, he would pray these psalms of penitence, reviewing his own life and bringing all of this before God and submitting it to God's gracious forgiveness as he was anticipating now the conclusion of his life. And thus died the great Augustine in 430 A.D. And as I say, this is an individual that God has used mightily, that in many cases some of the most important subsequent thinkers in the church's history owed huge debts. This one.